here's the things that they need to know. Verse 4, we will not hide them from their children, but tell to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and His might and the wonders He has done. Verse 5, He established a testimony in Jacob. He appointed a law in Israel, which He commanded our fathers to teach their children, that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn, and arise and tell them to their children, so that they should set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep His commandments. If you look at verse 4 and verse 5, I think we can boil it down to two things. Verse 4, the next generation needs to know God's mighty deeds. God's mighty deeds. In verse 5, they need to know God's righteous law. God's mighty deeds and God's righteous law. When we talk about God's mighty deeds, what we mean is the things that God has done throughout history. Both the redemptive history in the Bible, how He was there in the Exodus and in the cross and all the miracles, God's redemptive history, but also your own testimony. The mighty deeds that God has done in your life. They need to know God's mighty deeds, but they also need to know God's righteous law. The things that God commands. You should do this and you should not do this. The ethics of Christianity, if you will. And we have to pass on both. If you only pass on one and not the other, it doesn't work. It's not enough to know about God's mighty deeds, but not about His laws about sin and righteousness. It doesn't do enough to know about the do's and don'ts and not know about who God is and what He's done and that He's a Savior. Parrott and Kang, they write this temptation for first generations especially. We like to teach God's righteous law sometimes and forget God's mighty deeds. They say this: here's a temptation common to many of us who are first generation Christians, called to raise our children in the faith. Instead of the mighty deeds of the Lord on our behalf, we offer our children a list of what they should do and not do. In the process, we might potentially sap the Spirit right out of the glorious, life-transforming gospel, extricating the amazing grace from God's character. In the end, all we offer is the gospel according to our own image and pass that on to our children. So we got to be careful, church. If the only thing people know in our church is, as young people, is, Christians can't do this and they can't have this and they're not allowed to go to do this, that's not Christianity. Yes, God's righteous deeds are part of Christianity. God's righteous law is part of Christianity. But what about God as Savior? What about God meeting you at the lowest place of your life? What about God transforming your life in His grace and what He's done for people and His kindness and His love? We need both. God's mighty deeds as well as God's righteous law. I find it interesting that God always saves before He gives rules. Did you know that? God always saves before He gives rules. He always blesses before He gives law. The first of the 10 commandments is actually not even a command. If you read it, Exodus 20, it says, God spoke all these words saying, I am the Lord your God. Watch this. Who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And then He says, you shall have no other gods before me. God's first word in the 10 commandments is not even a command. It's, I am a God who saved you from slavery. The whole law, the whole relationship is based on the fact that God is a good God who saves His people. And that's why you shouldn't worship any other God. Same thing with Adam and Eve. God did not create Adam and Eve, and the first word He said is, hey, don't eat that tree. What did God do? He blessed them. He made them in His image. He provided for them. They had nice rivers flowing through the Garden of Eden and all the different... If you ever read Genesis 2 and it's like, what's the deal with all these stones, It's showing that God is a God of blessing. That God cares for His creation. So, why do we tell the next generation to listen to God? Because He's a good God who loves us and blesses us and wants the best for us. Brothers and sisters, this is true of every relationship in life. If you don't trust someone's character, you don't care what they tell you to do. They can give you all kinds of do's and don'ts, but if they don't trust your character, that you're good and you have their best interest in mind, the rest won't matter. And so we have to introduce the next generation to God as a person, a good person, what He has done, both in the Bible as well as in my life.